Okay, so let's get right into Chapter 13 of our continuing adventure. Chapter 13 kind of starts with our heroes, and I put that in quotes, simply because, well, for obvious reasons, is that they're obviously not really heroes in the traditional sense, but they are treated as heroes when they march into Chihuahua. And the reason why is because they have a bunch of scalps. So in this period of time, the natives and the Mexicans in this area were kind of battling amongst themselves for the land, um, much like the Americans as they came in would start to take over the land, and then obviously the natives would fight back, and so there was a lot of stuff going on here between them. So the scalps, as they come in, are counted, and they're treated as heroes because, of course, they're supposedly getting rid of the vicious Indian tribes, when, we know the reality is that they just kind of go in and slaughter people. Um, but because there's a bounty on scalps, on Indian scalps, they just kind of bring them in to get paid. And it's at this point where we get a really close look at the gang, because they go into these baths, these sort of public baths, and the it's kind of a public area, and so the people that are living in there, kind of gather around just to see kind of what's going on, and the muck and stuff comes off of them, and they sort of reveal themselves to be really scarred up, sort of mutilated kind of people. Certainly not heroic in the sense. Maybe one thing to note, and see, at least as far as character traits, is sort of how the judge enters the water. It's a really interesting scene where he kind of daintily, he's completely naked, of course, because he's going into the bath, and he kind of daintily, dips his toe in, and, kind of just showing off a little bit, for the gathered crowd. An interesting insight into the characters here, as we get a close look at them. So it might be something to make note of if you're going to use a scene to sort of analyze the characters. Once they're cleaned up, they meet the local governor, who is named Angel Frias. He is a sort of a Mexican, I don't know what you would call him. He's like a commander-in-chief kind of guy for the area, and he's essentially the governor, and he hosts these people at the gang at a dinner. And one thing to note is sort of that Angel, or Angel, is sort of really, the term is probably a fit, meaning he's like really, I may be mispronouncing that. He's very cultured, but he has this idea of what violence is, right? That it's sort of this noble pursuit. Maybe you've met people like this before that maybe have never actually encountered violence, but they sort of, tell you all about sort of how if they were in that situation, they would beat that guy up, and you guys are like these vicious people, and so he's an interesting contrast to the gang, because the gang's just like, okay, well, we're just here to eat, right? We kind of do this stuff and we don't really think about it. But Angel is really somebody that idolizes, in a way, these people. And if you look at it through that lens, that interaction becomes a little bit maybe more interesting. So once there, it's noted that the men have enormous appetites, followed by scenes of debauchery that are repeated night after night. I'll go over all of this a little bit more as I move on, because these are just sort of the plot elements. Excuse me if I wander off a little bit in terms of the analysis. The plot continues. They move to after they go through this. Essentially, what happens is they go in, they get treated as heroes, they overstay their welcome, so to speak, and they get kicked out. And that's kind of a cycle that starts to happen once they move on to this other area, Coyome. Gomez is mentioned again, that Gomez, not Gomez, that I mentioned in the previous section. And then 3 days later, this hero-villain loop happens again. What I mean by that is that in this area, they get treated as heroes because they're here to sort of, get rid of the Mexicans, and then they overstay their welcome again, in obvious ways, and then by pretty much acting violent in who they are, they sort of deflate anybody's perceptions of who and what they are. Therefore, they cross into Texas, where Glanton is subject to arrest, quote unquote subject to arrest. And it's an interesting scene because, you kind of say, are we in Texas? Or are we in Mexico? Because I kind of neat to know. It tells you a little bit, maybe a little clue about sort of how borders work here, right? It's like they're kind of crossing over into different countries, different territories, different authorities. So that's one thing that maybe to note is that as they cross into another area, they're like, okay, am I supposed to be arrested here? Or I don't remember. If we're in Texas, then that's different than we're in Mexico, but they don't really know, right? Because they're just sort of wandering around. One interesting moment here in this chapter is how they pick and choose the natives that they attack. There's a winter camp of the Chilenos, which are actual like battle-ready Indians, right? Who might actually conceivably be attacking these areas where they're paying bounties to get rid of the Indians. But then they pass those by because that's just a fight that they don't want to do, because they'll get just as much money for slaughtering these Tiguas who are essentially land-based peaceful, right? So why battle the real danger when they can just go to the peaceful? And because of the sort of racial ideas at the time, one could say racism, there's no distinction, right, among the settlers, the people that are coming in. They don't distinguish between one kind of Indian and another. It's just, just killed a bunch of Indians, then everything's good, right? Later on, they move over to an area with some cave drawings, and this is an interesting moment where, and I hate to use that word interesting again, but I don't really know how else to put it, fascinating perhaps, where the judge actually sees these cave drawings and then just scrapes them away, these ancient cave drawings after he draws them. Kind of a strange moment, but as I go into maybe a little bit more of the elements that are involved here, some deeper elements involved, maybe that will make a little bit more sense. It's not out of character for the judge to do things like that. So they escape. Eventually, they get escorted by the military and taken to an area called the Cody. And once there, they see a funeral procession, basically, that's coming by. Somebody died, so there's this big procession, and they get into a fight, and they start killing a bunch of people. And this is pretty much par for the course. And at the end of the chapter, there's this line here that's sort of chilling in many ways. Hair, the string ain't run out on this train yet. So in other words, they are still being paid for native scalps. So once they shoot and kill a bunch of people, it's like, oh well, these are Mexicans, but their hair is still dark. So why not? Let's just take these and then get paid for it. So kind of this weird, like, I don't know, your hair is dark enough, maybe you'll pass for a native, so let's just scalp you and see if we can get the money for it. So a little chilling moment. They slaughter people in a church. There's a moment where they attack a column of soldiers. So they're really going way, the chaos is really getting out of control at this point. In other words, these are just two examples in this chapter. Eventually, they chase down the remaining soldiers. When they leave the area, they're encounter a column of soldiers. They attack it. A couple of people try to escape, and then they chase them down, and then they kill them basically at the gates of the area, the city that the soldiers were going to. Right. So they kill them just outside the gates before they could go in and warn them. It's like, hey, these guys are coming to kill everybody. But in any case, they scalp, they bury them, and then they take in their scalps into the city that was about to be warned, and get the money for it, right? So presumably this loop starts all over again. So I'll use the term it's comical, but not in a funny kind of sense, because this is sort of a really dark kind of idea, but there's something absurd about this, right? So a real quick mention at the end. There's a mention of pandemonium, how pandemonium ensues. It's like in the last page. And the only reason I highlighted that is because of Paradise Lost. That may be a reference to pandemonium and Paradise Lost. for those of you that want to look that up, you're more than welcome to, but I'll just say that Pandemonium is the hall in Paradise Lost where the angels, the archangels meet to plan their revenge, especially against mankind and God. But I'll leave that to the literary people in the audience. Notes. Okay, think a little bit about the baths, as I mentioned before. Why could no one take their eyes off the judge? That's a direct quote. That's one thing to consider, is that he's this hypnotic presence. He's charismatic, obviously. And this is just another example of his charisma, sort of how he plays up, like I said before, how he daintily touches his toe in the water and sort of plays to the audience. That's a suggestion of the charisma that he has. Angel Trias, as I mentioned before, that general who invited them into the banquet. What would you make of the fact that Glanton's gang warmed something in him? Meaning there's something about this Glanton gang that sort of warmed his heart, even though these guys are really vicious, brutal people that we've been following around that have no romance to them. In other words, there's nothing romantic about what they're doing. But somehow Angel wants to believe that they're like these noble fighting forces that are just, there's something about violence that seems to sort of warm his heart. I think the reality is different than sort of his fantasy of it. There's a little mention of Mejor los Indios. It's some graffiti that happens in the course of the Glanton gang visiting causing chaos within the city, meaning that they came in to presumably wipe out the Indians to protect this village, but this village is now basically saying Mejor los Indios, which is, better the Indians, in essentially. But it does lead to a question as why the Spanish remains untranslated. So in this book, the Spanish is untranslated. So whenever there's a mention of people talking in Spanish, you kind of walk through it. Not super complicated for me because, I understand Spanish. But as a reader in English, presumably when this was the audience, this is how it was written, that's intentional, right? And then there's a reference to Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is a reference to a Disney short that I've linked in the page itself. So if you want to go see that and understand that reference, I think it should be a little bit clearer once you watch it, how, essentially the chaos gets out of control really fast in a way that you can't control. So forces are at work that sometimes you cannot control. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, and this is a preview of chapter 14, so I will move on in the next video. Thank you for your patience.